Good evening, everyone. So, I'll be discussing about decompensated chronic liver disease and acute on chronic liver failure in this presentation. So, let's start with one case scenario. A 45-year-old man has been shifted to ICU from ward with complaints of altered sensorium since one day, which has now increased. He has a decreased urine output, which is low since morning, and ascitic tapping was done, which has partially improved his urine output. Oxygen saturation is 84% on room air, and on further eliciting the history, he is a chronic alcoholic and has been diagnosed as CLD 1 year back, but has not been abstinent with alcohol. So, how do you proceed from here? We all know this is a case of decompensated CLD, and the decompensation is manifesting in form of ascites, hepatic encephalopathy, and probably hepatorenal syndrome. So we will deal with each of these decompensation one by one. Let's start with hepatic encephalopathy. So what is hepatic encephalopathy? It's a syndrome of neuropsychiatric dysfunction caused by portosystemic venous shunting with or without intrinsic liver disease. So presence of liver disease is not mandatory for hepatic encephalopathy. In fact, hepatic encephalopathy has been divided into three types, where type A is one which is present in acute liver failure with the fulminant hepatitis. Type B is present in a patient with portosystemic bypass without any intrinsic liver disease, and type C is in cirrhotics with portal hypertension. So the further discussion will be about the type C hepatic encephalopathy, which we commonly encounter. So what is the pathogenesis of hepatic encephalopathy? It's a complex interplay of several factors, of which ammonia plays a central role. So there is a direct neurotoxic effect of ammonia. Also, because of the hepatocyte dysfunction and portosystemic venous shunting, the ammonia is not being metabolized into urea in the liver, and this ammonia concentration increases and it crosses the blood-brain barrier, which can reach the astrocytes in the brain and convert the glutamate to glutamine. And this glutamine can increase the osmotic pressure inside the astrocyte, leading to further astrocytic swelling, and which can further increase the development of reactive oxygen species, and which can further worsen the astrocytic swellings. So there are several other factors which can lead to hepatic encephalopathy, like GABA-like molecules that can act as GABA agonist, which is mainly inhibitory neurotransmitter. So what are the precipitating causes of hepatic encephalopathy? Most common being dehydration, constipation, any new onset GI bleed, infections in form of cellulitis, UTI, or commonly spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. Any electrolyte imbalance in form of hypokalemia and hyponatremia also worsens the hepatic encephalopathy, renal failure, any sedatives being given for the encephalopathy, or TIPS has been done, and this TIPS has led to a new onset encephalopathy or hepatocellular carcinoma. So all these precipitating cause, what they are doing is, their underlying mechanism is increasing the load of ammonia, either by increasing the substrate for the production or decreasing its excretion. So what are the grades of hepatic encephalopathy? West and Heaven have given a grading system for hepatic encephalopathy. Grade 0, they are unimpaired. They have normal psychomotor and neuropsychological test. Grade 1, that is minimal hepatic encephalopathy. They have shortened attention span, and they have an impaired psychometric test, like addition and subtraction skills are impaired. Grade 2 hepatic encephalopathy, they are disoriented to time, and they have personality changes and inappropriate behaviors. It's grade 2 when we start picking hepatic encephalopathy, and they have flapping tremor in this grade also. Grade 3, they have gross disorientation to time as well as space, and they are somnolent, and they are confused when awake. Grade 4 is hepatic coma. So what are the diagnostic steps for hepatic encephalopathy? You have a history of liver disease with a recent change in altered behavior, altered sensorium, presence of flapping tremors, and normally most of the time you require CT scan to rule out any structural lesion, because sometimes the intracerebral bleed can also lead to this kind of altered behavior. or if there is presence of a new onset neurological deficit, or if the altered behavior is disproportionate in nature, then you need a CT scan to rule out any IC bleed. Blood ammonia level, arterial ammonia is also done, where level more than 150 micromole is corresponding to high hepatic encephalopathy, but it has more of a role in acute liver failure, where more than 250 is they have risk of cerebral edema. In stable chronic liver disease, arterial ammonia doesn't have much a role. How do you treat hepatic encephalopathy? Always correction of the precipitating cause, dehydration because of the diuretics, so you give IV saline infusions. Any GI bleed, so all medications or diagnostic and therapeutic endoscopy is required. Infections in form of broad spectrum antibiotic has to be given for spontaneous bacterial peritonitis or any underlying cellulitis or urinary tract infection. Pharmacological therapy, the mainstay of pharmacological therapy includes lactulose, which is a non-absorbable disaccharide, which is administered at a dose of 30 ml 2 to 4 times daily, and we target at 3 to 5 loose stool. And it's given orally in grade 1 and 2 HE, through Ryle's tube in higher grade of HE. Rectal enema is given in patient with ileus, tense ascites, or in conditions where there is inability to insert a nasogastric tube. But there is sometimes a barrier to adherence to lactulose therapy because of overuse. Even dehydration and hyponatremia can precipitate, and which can further worsen the hepatic encephalopathy. Retention enema can be given by mixing 300 ml of lactulose with 700 ml of tap water, and it can cause the side effect also, which can lead to decreased adherence to lactulose therapy, is abdominal cramping and distension, sweet taste, increased gas production leading to bloating sensation. So these are the barriers to adherence of lactulose therapy. Mechanism of action, it is catabolized by bacterial flora to short chain fatty acid, which lowers the colonic pH to about 5, and the reduction in pH favors the formation of non-absorbable ammonia from ammonium ion, and this ammonium ion is relatively impermeable to the gut, leading to trapping of ammonium ion in the colon, and which is being excreted in form of stool. The oral antibiotics, historically metronidazole, neomycin have been tried, but now rifaximin is the drug of choice. It's a non-absorbable rifamycin, and it gets concentrated in the gut because it is non-absorbable, and it leads to inhibition of production of ammonia or other neurotoxin by the intestinal bacteria, given in the dose of 400 mg TDS, but it has more role in cases of a chronic stable CLD, where you use rifaximin to prevent recurrence of hepatic encephalopathy. It's given more of use in a OPD basis. L-ornithine, L-aspartate, that is Hepa-merge. We know ammonia is removed from body by formation of urea in the periportal hepatocyte, or by synthesis of glutamine from glutamate. And in patient with cirrhosis, the activity of these important enzymes, that is carbamyl phosphate synthetase and glutamine synthetase, they are impaired, resulting in hyperammonemia. So L-ornithine, L-aspartate, it actually gives ornithine, which both as activator of these enzymes, and also it is used as a substrate for ureagenesis. So how much you give, if it is given in injectable form, oral and IV preparation, both Hepa-merge is available. So it is 10 ml solution which contains 5 grams of Hepa-merge. So you give 6 ampules, that is 30 gram of Hepa-merge. So you usually give at 10 ml per hour for 6 hours, usually given for 5 to 7 days. But one of the important contraindication is the renal dysfunction. So there are various cutoff being used for creatinine for use of Hepa-merge. It ranges from 1.5 to 2, and it differs center to center. So you have to be cautious while using Hepa-merge injectable form if the creatinine is raised more than 1.5 milligram per deciliter. So stringent dietary restriction of protein is in fact now not recommended, and in fact it worsens the morbidity, and they say that at least 0.5 to 1 gram per kg of supplementation of protein is required, because skeletal muscle is also one of the site where glutamate with ammonia is converted to glutamine. So if there is any sarcopenia in form of muscle loss, that can worsen the hepatic encephalopathy, so protein should be given. Zinc replacement is also recommended because it's an important cofactor in various enzymes which play an important role in urea cycle in liver. Keto analogs of branched chain amino acid, they have been used to decrease ammonia level by amination of the corresponding amino acid and inhibiting the protein breakdown, but as such they don't increase the nutritional status or they don't improve the mortality in patient with hepatic encephalopathy. Other therapies which has been used on experimental basis are sodium benzoate, which acts as an ammonia scavenger. It removes ammonia in the form of hippuric acid. Naloxone and flumazenil have been also tried on experimental basis. Flumazenil is a benzodiazepine antagonist, but there is no mortality benefit, and although it decreases clinical hepatic encephalopathy. Now we come to renal dysfunction in liver disease patient. What are the common causes of renal dysfunction in liver disease? Commonly it can be acute kidney injury due to underlying sepsis, hypovolemia because of dehydration because of diuretic or lactulose leading to GI losses, GI bleed, any NSAIDs because in cirrhotic patient prostaglandin plays an important role in the renal function, and if the prostaglandin synthesis is inhibited by NSAID, it can worsen the renal dysfunction. Use of nephrotoxic drugs like aminoglycoside and contrast agent, they can all attribute to the renal dysfunction in liver disease. And lastly, a hepatorenal syndrome, it's the most advanced stage of physiological alteration where there is a renal vasoconstriction and systemic hypotension which plays a major role in its pathophysiology. Creatinine may be falsely low due to poor muscle mass in patients with liver disease, and any small change in creatinine may signify a major decline in GFR. So any small change in creatinine should be taken as seriously in these patients. Urine analysis doesn't play much of a role in diagnosing HRS. If you see the osmolarity and the urine sodium both are less than 20, so it mimics like a pre-renal hypovolemia, because the pathophysiology essentially is almost similar, because in HRS there is also a decreased effective arterial blood volume. It's difficult to differentiate ATN and HRS based on urine analysis, but if there is any presence of tubular epithelial cell, that leads to indication that there is an underlying acute tubular necrosis. So HRS, it is defined as a functional renal failure in patient with liver disease with portal hypertension, and the basic pathogenesis underlying is a severe renal vasoconstriction and arterial hypotension, and it occurs exclusively in patient with ascites. The diagnostic criteria for HRS has been given by the International Society for Ascites, where they have said a mandatory presence of ascites with cirrhosis, a serum creatinine more than 1.5 milligram per deciliter, and after at least 2 days of diuretic withdrawal and volume expansion with albumin, there is no sustained improvement of serum creatinine, absence of shock, no current or recent treatment with any nephrotoxic drug, any absence of any renal parenchymal disease. So these are the important diagnostic criteria for HRS. What are the precipitating cause of HRS? Always in more than 50% of cases you have an underlying factor which lead to HRS, like any bacterial infection in form of SBP, any recent large volume paracentesis, any GI bleed, a severe acute alcoholic hepatitis. All these lead to a renal vasoconstriction, and there is an imbalance in the renal vasoconstrictor and vasodilator which leads to HRS. What are types of HRS? It's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is rapidly progressive, where the creatinine rises or doubles within 2 weeks and reaches as high as 2.5 milligram per deciliter. The median survival is only 2 weeks, and this is one of the indication for liver transplant. You have to fast track these patients with chronic liver disease which have started developing HRS type 1, and most of the cases they have a precipitating factor in type 1 HRS and the underlying SBP is there. In type 2 HRS, they are slowly progressive in nature. The creatinine level is stable, doesn't exceed more than 1.5 milligram per deciliter, and the median survival is 4 to 6 months. How do you manage HRS? Most important factor is removal of the causative factor, elimination of any nephrotoxic drug, elimination and treatment of bacterial infection, any SBP, cellulitis has to be treated, or underlying UTI, elimination of any bleeding in form, you need a diagnostic scopy or therapeutic thing for that, or elimination of any non-steroidal anti-rheumatics because they inhibit the prostaglandins, and which is one of the important factor in cirrhotics for renal function. Elimination of diuretics because it can lead to hypovolemia, and supplementation of intravascular volume with albumin is recommended for management of HRS. So the general measure is Type 1 HRS usually they require hospitalization because it's very rapid in progression. Type 2 can be managed even on OPD basis. Paracentesis of tense ascites should be done and albumin should be used as a volume replacement. Sometimes this decrease in the intra-abdominal pressure with tense ascites can improve the renal function. Albumin replacement should be given in the range of 6 to 8 gram per liter for the ascitic fluid removal. So the basic treatment for HRS include drugs like a systemic vasoconstrictor, and in adjunct therapy albumin should be given. So the goal of therapy is to reverse the underlying renal failure and prolong survival until the candidate undergoes a liver transplant. The drug of choice is terlipressin, while if you use NORAD or terlipressin, there is no difference in the mortality. But terlipressin acts on the V1 receptor, which is predominantly present in the splanchnic circulation, and the systemic effects are less. But the side effects with terlipressin are any organ ischemia or digital ischemia. They have to be taken care of, and you have to always be cautious in using patients with underlying ischemic heart disease and watch for any arrhythmia while you are using terlipressin. So it's usually contraindicated in those subset of patients. It can cause a systemic vasoconstriction and thus increase the cardiac output, and finally decreasing the renal vasoconstriction, which is the basic pathophysiology underlying the HRS. The dosage of terlipressin is 0.5 to 1 milligram twice daily. If the creatinine doesn't decrease by 20% on day 2, then you have to increase the dose by 1 to 2 milligram every 4 hours, and the maximum duration of therapy is up to 2 weeks, and always it has to be given in adjunct with albumin therapy to increase the volume status, and it improves the mortality if terlipressin is given with albumin. Transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt, what it does, it increases the venous return by decreasing the splanchnic vasodilation and pooling of the intravascular volume in the splanchnic bed. And sometimes this increase in venous return and increased cardiac output can improve the renal hypotension and improve the renal function, but it may precipitate a already compromised cardiac function because of the underlying cirrhotic cardiomyopathy, and if there is a sudden increase in the venous return because of the pooling from portal to the systemic circulation. So sometimes this heart failure may be unmasked after TIPS, so have to be cautious because they already have a cirrhotic cardiomyopathy. What if the medical therapy and TIPS fail in these patients? Then renal replacement therapy is the last resort if the medical therapy fail. Patients who are not candidate for liver transplant, they should be dialyzed early if medical therapy fails, and who are otherwise candidate for liver transplant, they should undergo a semi-urgent workup because the median survival is very low in weeks, as HRS is one of the indication of liver transplant. But post liver transplant also these patients, they have increased morbidity, and the use of renal replacement therapy is required more, and the length of stay is also more in these patients after they undergo a liver transplant. Diagnostic abdominal paracentesis is recommended in these patients where you prefer left lower quadrant. If you are using blind technique, then they say that the right quadrant should not be used because the cecum can be dilated with use of lactulose, but nowadays nobody does a blind ascitic tapping. You should use a bedside ultrasound to use ascitic tapping, diagnostic and therapeutic, and you should try and avoid the inferior epigastric vessel. Routine use of FFP plasma is not recommended in ascitic tapping. You send a test for cell count, differential and serum ascites albumin gradient. If you are suspecting infection, then culture should be done at the bedside itself in culture bottle. Role of SAG is if the SAG value is more than 1.1, that indicates portal hypertension, heart failure or Budd-Chiari syndrome. It's less than 1.1, it indicates infection, pancreatic cancer or tuberculosis. So what is the treatment for ascites? Abstinence for alcohol in patient with alcoholic liver disease. It sometimes reduces the ascites. Dietary restriction with sodium less than or equal to 2 gram per day, which equals to around 88 millimoles of it, and less than 2 gram can make the food unpalatable and the patient will not eat. It will further worsen his protein caloric malnutrition. So up to 2 gram is recommended. No fluid restriction is recommended unless the hyponatremia is as low as 125 millimole per liter, and oral dual diuretics in form of spironolactone and furosemide is given in the ratio of 100 mg of spironolactone and 40 milligram of furosemide. And these patients, they have usually hypervolemic hyponatremia, so you can try Vaptans for this also. In some case report, they have said that you can try something called as furosemide test, where you give 80 milligram furosemide and you measure the urinary sodium for 8 hours. If it is less than 50 millimole, it indicates it's a diuretic resistant ascites, and in those patients you have to fast track for other alternative therapy. So always for diuretic to act, you need a sufficient GFR and a higher MAP. Large volume paracentesis, you have to infuse 6 to 8 gram of albumin per liter of ascitic tapping if you are tapping more than 5 liter, and will be this recollection can be prevented only if you have a strict dietary intake of sodium and MAP is maintained. What is refractory ascites? It's ascites unresponsive to sodium restriction and high dose of diuretic and spironolactone as high as 400 and furosemide 160 milligram, or the ascites which recurs rapidly after therapeutic tapping. Failure of diuretic diuretic therapy as a treatment for refractory ascites is manifested as a minimal or no weight loss, any inadequate excretion of sodium, or development of complication like NCAF, hyponatremia or hyperkalemia. And in these cases, the therapy include therapeutic tapping with albumin, adding midodrine, which is now available in doses of 7.5 milligram TDS, transplant and TIPS. SBP is defined as more than 250 polymorphonuclear cell in ascitic sample without evidence of any intra-abdominal surgical treatable cause like secondary peritonitis. What is the underlying pathophysiology? It's both the humoral and cell-mediated immunity is impaired in cirrhosis, and there is a decreased bacterial clearance and functional alteration in intestinal mucosa causing bacterial translocation, finally leading to SBP. How do you treat it? IV antibiotic should be administered, and drug of choice is third generation cephalosporin because they cover Enterobacteriaceae and non-enterovoccal streptococci. But if you are dealing with nosocomial SBP, then carbapenems is recommended. Albumin infusion as an adjunctive therapy has to be given with SBP, and it decreases mortality and improves the HRS also. So now we come to our causes of hypoxemia in liver disease patients. So in context of liver disease patient, hypoxemia can be because of ascites leading to splintic, any hepatic hydrothorax, or a patient with COPD having underlying liver disease, or a hepatopulmonary syndrome. What is hepatopulmonary syndrome? It is basically a defect in arterial oxygenation induced by pulmonary vascular dilatation in setting of liver disease, and is defined as arterial hypoxemia. The definition of arterial hypoxemia is associated with HPS is based on measurement of partial pressure of oxygen that is performed with patient in a standardized position, preferably sitting and at rest. So when there is evidence of orthodeoxia in these patients, because this intrapulmonary vascular dilation, they are more prominent in the basal portion of the lungs. So when the patient is sitting rather than recumbent, the shunting increases, that worsens the hypoxia. What are diagnostic criteria? Oxygenation defect in the form of partial pressure oxygen less than 80, A gradient more than 15, and you can grade the severity based on the oxygenation status is more than 80, 60 to 80, 50 to 60 or less than 60, mild, moderate, severe and very severe, and pulmonary vascular dilatation, which has been proven based on the contrast echocardiography, which using a bubble, a saline bubble, or macroaggregate albumin scanning, and a coexisting liver disease in form of portal hypertension with or without cirrhosis. So how you do this contrast enhanced echocardiography? You use agitated saline which produces microbubbles of size more than 10 micron in diameter, and after administering this agitated saline, you will see on echocardiography it will appear in the right atrium RV, and after 5 to 6 heartbeat you will find it appearing in the left atrium. So normally these around 10 micrometer size of microbubbles should be trapped in the capillaries, but in presence of intrapulmonary vascular dilatation you can see the delayed opacification of these bubbles. If it appears within 3 cardiac cycle, it indicates presence of intracardiac shunt. Another method, which is macroaggregate albumin scanning, is used for diagnosing HPS, where you use technetium-99 albumin macroaggregate, which is size more than 20 micrometer in diameter, and they are almost always trapped in the pulmonary circulation. But in presence of cardiac right to left shunt or any intrapulmonary vascular dilatation, this uptake can be documented in other organs such as brain or spleen. So if in the brain the uptake is more than 6%, then you can diagnose HPS. Clinical feature we have already discussed, dyspnea, orthodeoxia, and there is a diffusion-perfusion mismatch which worsens in upright position because this intrapulmonary vascular dilatation is more in the dependent part of the lung. You can also see clubbing, spider nevi, evidence of liver disease. Carbon monoxide diffusion capacity is also decreased because of widening of the capillary this thing. And treatment includes oxygen supplementation. Liver transplant is the only successful treatment. Generally, it takes 3 to 6 months for the shunt to close and hypoxemia to recede. So, I will just briefly, this is the last topic, we will be discussing differences between ACLF and acute hepatic decompensation CLD. We all know acute hepatic decompensation is the new onset of ascites, HE, a GI bleed or a bacterial infection in chronic liver disease, while ACLF is the presence of acute decompensation with organ failure and with a short-term mortality where the 28-day mortality is very low with underlying precipitating events such as it may be extrahepatic in the form of bacterial infection, GI bleed or hepatic in form of alcohol, any recent acute reactivation of hepatitis B. So there is a lot of heterogeneity in definition of ACLF. Almost 13 definition has been recommended, but the consensus group of the European and American Society, they have said that ACLF is acute decompensation of hepatic function in cirrhotic patient, either secondary to superimposed liver injury or due to system precipitating factor culminating in multiple organ dysfunction, and always associated with increased short-term mortality. And they have used this CLIF chronic liver failure consortium ACLF score, which is a modified version of SOFA score, which ranges from 0 to 100. So it is based on the number of organ dysfunction, the extrahepatic organ dysfunction. They can classify into no ACLF, grade 1, 2 and 3, and the mortality increase, the short-term mortality increases as the number of organ dysfunction increases. You can see if there is a no ACLF, the mortality is up to 5%. As there is one organ dysfunction, the mortality is up to 22%. With two organ dysfunction is 32%, and with three organ dysfunction it is as high as 77%. And the basic pathogenic mechanism is unclear, but the hallmark of this condition is excessive systemic inflammation, which could trigger the organ failure. Management is underlying precipitant factor should be treated with antibiotics for bacterial infections, steroids for severe alcoholic hepatitis, and nucleoside analogs for hepatitis B flare-up if there is a reactivation. And the management per se is mainly supportive with intensive monitoring and support of failing organs. Salvage liver transplant is recommended, and sometimes extracorporeal liver support system, particularly albumin dialysis or high volume plasma exchange, has been recommended as a bridge to liver transplant in patient with ACLF. Thank you.